Welcome, dear subscribers and curious listeners of my channel. Dolores Umbridge, a name that sends shivers down the spine, even for those who survived Voldemort. Somehow, she managed to become one of the most hated figures in the entire Harry Potter universe, surpassing even He Who Must Not Be Named in sheer repulsiveness. She first appeared as the defense against the dark arts teacher and quickly turned Hogwarts into an outpost of the Ministry, a place ruled by fear, informants, and pink lace. Later, under the Dark Regime, she became an outright instrument of oppression. Today, we'll revisit the most disturbing and intriguing facts about this colourful and terrifying woman. Enjoy watching. Number 1. The Horcrux didn't make her evil. One of the most chilling scenes in the final books is when Harry, Hermione, and Ron infiltrate the Ministry of Magic to steal the locket from around Umbridge's neck. She was wearing a Horcrux, one of Voldemort's dark artifacts, claiming it was a family heirloom bearing the letter S, supposedly from the ancient pureblood Selwyn line. But the most terrifying part, the Horcrux, which intensifies the darkness in a person's soul, had almost no effect on her. While even Ron cracked under its influence, Umbridge continued basking in her own authority. Evil had nowhere further to grow inside her. The Horcrux simply emphasized what was already there. Number 2. She was a half-blood pretending to be pure. The bitter irony of Umbridge's life is that while she zealously persecuted Muggleborns, she herself was a half-blood. Her father was a wizard, her mother a Muggle, and her brother turned out to be a squib. Ashamed of her family, she severed all ties early on. She made her father, a janitor at the Ministry, resign and lied to anyone who asked, insisting that Orford Umbridge was no relation of hers. She built a false identity as a pure-blood and wore it convincingly, especially in front of those whose respect she craved. Number 3. She headed the Muggleborn Registration Commission. Once the Ministry fell under Voldemort's control, Umbridge was in her element. She was appointed head of the Muggleborn Registration Commission, essentially a modern-day Inquisition. This body issued unjust accusations against anyone without magical parents. They were declared thieves of magic, had their wands confiscated, and were imprisoned. For Umbridge, this wasn't just a job. It was a perfect outlet for her sadism, all under the guise of legal authority. Number 4. A wand too short. Umbridge's wand was one of the shortest in the wizarding world, just 8 inches, made of cherry wood with a unicorn hair core. According to Ollivander, wand length reflects character, not physical size. Short wands often choose those who crave control and dominance, with a weak moral compass. A perfect match, wouldn't you say? Number 5. She was never happy at Hogwarts. Umbridge's unpopularity dates back to her school days. Even then, she wasn't liked by fellow students or teachers. Although she was in Slytherin and her head of house was the genial Horace Slughorn, he never appointed her a prefect. Her classmates sensed the falseness and cruelty hidden behind her forced, sweet smile. Perhaps it was at Hogwarts where the traits that would later make her a pink-clad monster began to take root. Number 6. Her rise through the ranks. Right after graduating from Hogwarts, Umbridge began working as a junior intern in the Department for the Improper Use of Magic. A dull beginning, but she turned it into a fast-track career path, climbing the ladder step by step without shame or scruples. Her relentless ambition and eagerness to please those in power paid off. She eventually became senior undersecretary to the minister and a member of the Wizengamot. Morality and conscience never got in her way, only personal ambition did. Number 7. She never married. Despite her efforts to get close to influential men in the ministry, Umbridge never married. She didn't seek love, she sought status. But even those who admired her efficiency and zeal quickly realized that getting close to her was dangerous. Rumor had it she tried staging accidental encounters with eligible bachelors, particularly high-ranking officials. But even the staunchest blood purity advocates were disturbed by her methods. Her obsession with control, her views on Muggleborns, they frightened people more than the Cruciatus curse. Number 8. Obsessed with pink and cats. Dolores Umbridge wrapped her cruelty in pink. Her office looked like a dollhouse, lace curtains, velvet bows, and rows of decorative plates, each one enchanted with a meowing, blinking kitten. The walls purred, the teacups clinked, and at the centre of it all sat Umbridge, sipping from a floral cup and planning her next punishment. Visitors expected warmth. What they found was fear. "Take a biscuit," she would offer sweetly, even as she prepared to banish a teacher or interrogate a child. It was a performance, a trap, and everyone in Hogwarts knew it. Even Professor Flitwick, small and usually cheerful, avoided her office when he could. "The place gives me chills," he once muttered. Students trembled when summoned there. The softness was a mask, the kittens a distraction. Every pink doily covered something sharp. "She's like a toad in a ballerina dress," Ron said. And he was right. Her love of cute things didn't make her harmless. It made her worse, because she used sweetness the way others used hexes, with precision, with power, and with no mercy at all. Number 9, collector of magical torture devices. Dolores Umbridge didn't punish. She experimented. Her blood quill was only the beginning. When Harry wrote, "I must not tell lies," during detention, the words carved themselves into the back of his hand. "You haven't asked me to use ink," he said, horrified. "Oh, you won't need ink," she replied, smiling sweetly. That wasn't discipline. That was torture. And it wasn't the only tool in her collection. Whispers in the ministry told of cursed cuffs that tightened with every lie, a mirror that showed the student's worst fear over and over, a chair that drained magic temporarily from those who sat in it. She kept her favourites close, locked in velvet-lined drawers. Some were banned centuries ago, others had no known creator. All had one thing in common: they hurt without leaving a mark. Dolores believed pain should be silent, invisible, and permanent. After her time at Hogwarts, students like Lee Jordan and Michael Corner described weeks of numb fingers, twitching hands, and haunted dreams. But no scars. That was her signature, hidden cruelty, wrapped in pink. What others destroyed with spells, she achieved with silence and rules. Number 10, hated half-human creatures. Dolores Umbridge didn't just hate Muggleborns. She despised anyone who wasn't fully human. She considered centaurs dangerous, giants uncivilized, werewolves contagious. Even house elves, who asked for nothing but servitude, disgusted her. She lobbied for restrictions on half-breeds at the ministry and pushed for background checks on students with questionable bloodlines. When she arrived at Hogwarts, she targeted Hagrid from the start. She called his lessons barbaric and questioned his parentage. "You are not qualified to teach," she said coldly, pretending her issue was professionalism. But everyone knew the truth. She couldn't stand what he was. Her cruelty climaxed when she marched into the Forbidden Forest with Harry and Hermione, chasing lies about a secret weapon. What she found instead were centaurs, fierce, proud, and very real. She spoke to them the same way she spoke to students, with arrogance and control. But they were not children. "Filthy half-breeds," she hissed. That was her mistake. The forest rose up against her. The centaurs dragged her away, screaming. Her pink cardigan was no shield. Her title meant nothing. She vanished into the trees as her wand fell from her hand. It was the first and only time she tasted fear without power. She returned later, silent and broken. No one knew what the centaurs had done. No one asked, but her silence spoke louder than her usual rules and punishments. It was justice, raw and ancient, delivered not by courts or decrees, but by the very creatures she called beasts. In that moment her hatred collapsed under its own weight, and the forest reminded her, and everyone else, that there are some lines no law can protect you from crossing. Number 11. Not in the order, but knew too much. Dolores Umbridge was never part of the Order of the Phoenix, but somehow she always knew what they were doing. She knew names, she knew locations, she knew timing. It wasn't magic, it was something worse, surveillance. She had a quiet web of informants buried deep inside the ministry. Some said she paid them, others whispered she blackmailed them. But the results were clear. Every time the Order made a move, Umbridge was already watching. That's how she knew Dumbledore's army existed before even some students did. She sniffed out meetings, tracked unsigned parchments, and even suspected the room of requirement before it was revealed. Professor McGonagall, usually one step ahead, found herself cornered more than once. "If you are planning to undermine the ministry, Professor," Umbridge once said with a smile, "I do hope you've chosen your allies carefully." It wasn't an empty threat. Dolores didn't understand loyalty, but she understood fear. She used it like others used wands. She never named her sources, but the way she targeted specific students made it clear she wasn't guessing. She interrogated Seamus Finnegan after his mother expressed doubts about Dumbledore in the Daily Prophet. She pressured Ernie Macmillan, whose father worked in magical law enforcement. Even Marietta Edgecombe, Cho Chang's friend, was caught in her grip and betrayed Dumbledore's army because of it. The betrayal nearly destroyed Harry's group. That's how Umbridge worked. She didn't need to cast spells to break people. She used information. Some believed she even listened to flu conversations illegally. Others said she had eyes in every department, including magical transportation and international cooperation. She wasn't just watching Hogwarts, she was watching the war from the shadows. And yet, despite all her efforts, she was never truly part of the battle. She was never trusted, never welcomed. She knew everything and understood nothing. That was her curse and her power. Number 12. Master of legal manipulation. Dolores Umbridge didn't need power wands or dark magic to control people. She used paper, signatures, and rules. In the ministry, she was feared not for strength, but for her ability to twist laws like threads around her fingers. She didn't break the law. She reshaped it. She once rewrote a clause in the education decrees overnight, just to ban student groups like Dumbledore's army. Any student organization, society, team, group, or club is henceforth disbanded, read Educational Decree number 24. And it had her signature in shining black ink. That was how she fought back, by turning policy into a weapon. When she became High Inquisitor, she gave herself the power to inspect teachers. Then she used that same power to suspend them. She dismissed Professor Trelawney with cold precision, not because of incompetence, Sybil had taught for years, but because Umbridge could. "You have no authority to send anyone away from this castle," McGonagall snapped at her. Umbridge's reply was simple. "That power was granted to me under Educational Decree number 23. She didn't need to justify her choices. She simply changed the rules until they fit her decisions. Inside the ministry, she climbed by doing the same. If the law said no, she wrote a new law. If a form didn't exist, she created one. The Muggleborn Registration Commission. It was wrapped in official seals and parchment, complete with ministry logos and courtroom chairs. But beneath the polished surface, it was built on lies and cruelty. And no one could argue, because it was technically legal. Dolores believed justice was just a matter of who held the quill. That was her genius and her sickness. She saw laws not as protection, but as levers. Move them the right way and anyone could fall. She once said during a meeting, "Laws exist to serve the proper order. If they don't, they must be corrected. Not interpreted, not debated, corrected." That was her world, one where rules were tools, truth was flexible, and the line between justice and oppression was just a line she could erase. Number 13, she was put on trial after the war. After the fall of Voldemort, Dolores Umbridge didn't flee. She stayed in the ministry wearing her pink cardigan and acting like nothing had changed. She claimed she had only followed orders, claimed she had protected the wizarding world from chaos, claimed she was a victim of circumstance, but no one believed her, not anymore. The walls were closing in. Former students, ministry workers, and Muggleborns came forward. They remembered her smile, her voice, her blood quill, the courtroom filled with names and scars. Hermione Granger was among the first to testify. She stood in front of the Wizengamot and described the day she saw Umbridge send innocent witches and wizards to Azkaban. She knew exactly what she was doing, Hermione said. She wasn't forced, she enjoyed it. Lee Jordan submitted a list of victims, each arrested under Umbridge's Muggleborn Registration Commission. The most haunting statement came from Mary Cattermole, who had been dragged before Umbridge in a sham trial. "She looked me in the eyes," Mary whispered, "and told me I didn't deserve magic." The Wizengamot found Umbridge guilty on all charges: abuse of power, unlawful imprisonment, and magical torture. Her defense crumbled under the weight of evidence. She tried to object, her voice trembling, but no one listened. Kingsley Shacklebolt, now Minister for Magic, refused her any special treatment. She wasn't just demoted, she was stripped of her wand and taken straight to Azkaban, the same prison she had sent so many to, with a flick of her wrist and a smile on her face. Inside Azkaban she wasn't feared, she was forgotten. There were no pink teacups, no fluffy kittens on plates, just cold stone and silence. She asked for a private cell, she asked for quills and parchment to write her appeal. She was denied. The legacy she thought she had built, her laws, her rules, her order, was dust. In the end, Dolores Umbridge didn't go down as a martyr or protector. She went down as exactly what she was, a cruel woman who used the law not to serve justice, but to crush it. Number 14, fanatic, hatred toward Dumbledore. Dolores Umbridge despised Albus Dumbledore long before she ever set foot in Hogwarts as High Inquisitor. To her, he represented everything wrong with the magical world: too much freedom, too little control. His calm manner, eccentric robes, and quiet defiance of ministry power made her furious. She hated how students adored him. She hated how he treated half-breeds and Muggleborns as equals, and she especially hated the way he never seemed intimidated by her position or her rules. He stood for compassion, and she stood for control. That alone made him her enemy. During her brief reign at Hogwarts, Umbridge tried more than once to discredit Dumbledore. She questioned his leadership. She accused him of building a student army, and she was the one who sent 2 Aurors to drag him out of the school, but Dumbledore, with his usual flair, simply disappeared. "You seem to be laboring under the delusion that I am going to, what is the phrase, come quietly," he said, and vanished in a flash of phoenix fire. Umbridge was left humiliated. She wanted power, but he had something far more dangerous: respect. What made her hatred worse was that she could never control him the way she controlled others. She could intimidate teachers, she could silence students, but Dumbledore looked right through her. She once tried to corner Professor McGonagall into speaking against him, only to be met with fierce loyalty. Even Cornelius Fudge, who distrusted Dumbledore, couldn't give her what she truly wanted: his downfall. And that frustrated her beyond reason. She thought removing him would bring order. Instead, his absence only made Hogwarts rise against her. Her failure to destroy Dumbledore was the beginning of her unraveling. She underestimated how deeply he was loved. She thought rules and punishment could erase a legacy built on kindness. But students remembered who had protected them from the Chamber of Secrets, who had fought Voldemort when no one else dared. Dolores wanted to rewrite Hogwarts in her own image, but as long as Dumbledore's shadow hung over the castle, her authority was just an illusion. Number 15, creator of the most hated educational decree. Dolores Umbridge, a name that evokes unease in the hearts of every student who walked the corridors of Hogwarts during her infamous reign, wielded more than just a cruel smile and a deceptively sweet voice. Her true weapon was control, painfully precise, calculated, and dressed in the illusion of order. The pinnacle of her tyranny came in the form of a parchment, innocuously titled Educational Decree No. 26. To the ministry it was a protective measure, to the staff it was a warning. But to the students it was a silencing muzzle designed to kill truth before it could even form into words. The decree stated, "Teachers are hereby banned from giving students any information that is not strictly related to the subjects they are paid to teach." Behind this bureaucratic phrasing was a sinister intention. Umbridge wanted to ensure that no student would learn about Lord Voldemort's return, no matter how true or urgent the matter was. She wanted to sever the line between knowledge and experience, between those who had seen death rise again and those she preferred to keep in denial. And she succeeded, at least for a while, in silencing every voice that didn't fit the narrative of the ministry. The decision wasn't born out of stupidity. Umbridge was not a fool, nor was she unaware of the storm building outside the walls of Hogwarts. She simply believed that if she could control what the students heard, she could shape what they thought. That if Voldemort's name was never uttered, his return could remain a rumor. The decree was her answer to the whispers spreading like wildfire in hallways, to the questions students asked their professors, and to the professors who dared to answer. This wasn't just censorship, it was the strategic erasure of resistance. Minerva McGonagall, never one to bow easily, saw through the decree immediately. Her lectures became cold and clipped, as if her voice itself rebelled against the restrictions. Professor Flitwick, ever cautious, limited his conversation strictly to charms, but the discomfort lingered in the air whenever a curious hand was raised. Even Trelawney, often adrift in prophecy, seemed grounded by the decree's weight, muttering of doom, but careful to avoid naming it. The decree didn't silence just words, it silenced spirits. Harry Potter, freshly scarred not only by Cedric's death but by the world's refusal to believe him, felt the decree like a punch to the chest. He had witnessed Voldemort's return with his own eyes, and now he was being told he could not speak of it, could not ask about it, could not even hear others confirm it. "It's like they want us to be blind," Hermione had said, her voice shaking not with fear, but with fury. For Harry, the decree was Umbridge's most vile act yet, not because it hurt, but because it made others doubt him more. This doubt bred silence, and that silence bred loneliness. Students whispered in corners, afraid of being overheard. Some believed Harry, others chose comfort in Umbridge's lies. It was safer to believe that the world was fine, that the ministry was right, and that those who said otherwise were dangerous. And that was precisely what Umbridge wanted, to isolate Harry, not just from authority, but from his peers. With Decree No. 26, she was no longer just a teacher, she was a manipulator of minds. The decree gave her unprecedented power. If a professor slipped, if a conversation veered even slightly off topic, Umbridge could report them. And she did. One by one, Hogwarts' finest were dragged before her tribunal. Insubordination and inappropriate conduct became regular accusations. Even Dumbledore, ever calm and composed, walked with tighter shoulders. The decree gave Umbridge the legal grounds to dismantle the school's trust structure and reconstruct it in her own image, pink, polished, and poisonous. But Umbridge underestimated the resilience of truth. As she tightened her grip, resistance began to grow, not loudly but patiently, like roots beneath stone. It was in this atmosphere of oppression that Dumbledore's army was born. Ironically, it was the decree itself that inspired the rebellion. If Umbridge had hoped to control the students through silence, she had instead taught them how to speak without words. They gathered in secret, in the room of requirement, where walls listened and protected. It was Hermione who had the idea. Tired of watching their education decay, tired of watching fear take hold, she suggested that if the teachers could not teach them, they must teach themselves. "We need to learn how to fight," she said, and for once everyone agreed without hesitation. Harry, reluctant at first, became their leader. In the face of a ministry-sponsored lie, he would become the living truth. Decree number 26 had tried to erase him. Now he would be louder than ever. Neville Longbottom, once shy and trembling, began to find confidence in that hidden room. Ginny Weasley, sharp and fearless, practiced spells that her mother would have banned. Luna Lovegood, with her dreamy eyes, understood more than anyone that reality often hid behind fiction. These students, shaped by fear and injustice, became warriors not through battle, but through knowledge, knowledge that Umbridge had forbidden. Every protego, every Expelliarmus cast in that room was an act of rebellion. The decree may have stopped the flow of truth inside classrooms, but it couldn't stop the truth from burning inside hearts. In a twisted way, Umbridge did more to prepare the students for the coming war than anyone else. By trying to suppress their curiosity, she made them more curious. By trying to break their spirit, she strengthened it. Dumbledore's army became more than a club. It became proof that belief, when suppressed, doesn't vanish. It intensifies. Number 16. Suffered from a power complex. Dolores Umbridge sat high above the courtroom floor, her eyes cold and gleaming behind her signature velvet bow. The room echoed with the rustle of parchment and the shuffle of frightened feet. She did not smile. She beamed in that condescending, syrupy way that dripped with superiority. It was a look not of kindness, but of control. Umbridge's satisfaction never stemmed from justice. It came from domination. Her need to command, to be feared, to shape the world around her through forceful rules and whispered threats was not an accident of character. It was a compulsion. If the magical world had psychologists, they would say she suffered from a textbook case of power complex, the obsessive need to exert control over others, to fill a personal void of self-worth. Even her office at Hogwarts was a display of toxic control disguised as sweetness. The kittens on plates were more than decoration, they were masks. Every doily, every pink ribbon, every artificial giggle was a facade hiding something uglier, an authoritarian instinct that burned within her. When she became Hogwarts High Inquisitor, the depth of her pathology fully surfaced. She didn't merely enforce rules, she invented them daily, each more repressive than the last. Educational Decree number 24 forbade student gatherings. Number 26 banned unapproved clubs. Each decree was a bar on the cage she was building around the students, and she relished locking it tighter with each passing day. Her obsession with structure was more than discipline. It was a weapon. The louder she read the rules, the more she felt in control. As she paraded the hallways with that stubby wand and cat-like smile, she saw herself not as a protector of order, but as its goddess. "You have been told that a certain dark wizard is at large once again. This is a lie," she once declared to the assembled students, her voice trembling with glee. To deny reality was not just ministry policy, it was her method of control. She would shape truth itself if it meant maintaining power. It didn't matter what was real. What mattered was what Dolores Umbridge said was real. Yet power made her cruel, and the more she gained, the darker her methods became. The most horrifying example remains her treatment of Harry Potter. When he dared speak truth in defiance of her lies, she punished him with a detention like no other. "I must not tell lies," she ordered him to write, and the words etched themselves into his skin, blood forming letters on his hand. This was not punishment, this was domination. It was her signature written into flesh, a symbol of her belief that she owned the bodies and minds of those beneath her. She didn't merely want obedience, she demanded surrender. And when she was challenged, when cracks formed in her illusion of omnipotence, her fury became venomous. After Fred and George Weasley humiliated her with their fireworks spectacle, she didn't simply scold them. She tried to erase their existence from the school. She chased them with threats of expulsion, of Azkaban, of ruin. She couldn't tolerate chaos because it undermined her reign. In truth, every disruption felt to Umbridge like an attack on her identity. Without total control, she felt exposed, and so she struck back, each time more viciously than before. Her rise at the Ministry of Magic followed a similar pattern. Starting with modest roles in the Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures, she climbed the ranks not through talent, but through manipulation and sycophancy. When Cornelius Fudge grew paranoid and vulnerable, Umbridge seized the moment. She became his mouthpiece, his defender, and eventually his enforcer. As senior undersecretary, she found her throne, not a physical one, but a symbolic seat from which she could inflict policy, prejudice, and terror with an ink-dipped quill. Her hatred of half-breeds was not rooted in ideology, but in control. To her, werewolves, centaurs, and giants represented the untamed, the unmanageable. Her campaign against them, especially against Professor Lupin, revealed her terror of anything that existed outside her command. "Werewolves are dangerous creatures," she said in a pamphlet she distributed at Hogwarts, but what she truly feared was that they would not submit. When Remus Lupin was dismissed, she didn't just feel victorious, she felt safe. Safe from difference, safe from disorder. In the ministry-run Muggleborn Registration Commission, she went even further. Wearing the locket of Salazar Slytherin around her neck like a relic, she presided over sham trials with a twisted sense of piety. The locket did not grant her power, but it emboldened her thirst for it. Her voice grew shriller, her rules more brutal, and her eyes more distant. "You are here to prove that your blood is pure," she told frightened witches and wizards. But the trials were never about blood, they were about fear. She fed on it, every frightened glance, every trembling hand. Those were the offerings she demanded. Her cruelty was surgical. She knew precisely how to hurt without leaving a mark. Her greatest weapon was not magic, but bureaucracy. She used paperwork the way others used hexes. Her memos could destroy lives, her decrees could silence rebellion, and her silence could condemn the innocent. She wrapped her authoritarianism in the flag of order, convinced that what she did was righteous. "Progress for progress's sake," read one of her slogans, but it was never about progress, it was about obedience. Even her mannerisms betrayed her lust for control. She interrupted people constantly. She corrected pronunciation. She demanded formality. When interviewing staff at Hogwarts, she sat like an executioner, flipping through notes, not to understand, but to intimidate. Professor Trelawney, the divination teacher, became one of her primary victims. Umbridge found her eccentricity intolerable. When she fired her in front of the students, she did it with a smile. That moment, watching Trelawney sob in the courtyard, was not unpleasant for her. It was satisfying. She didn't feel guilt. She felt victory. Number 17 believed in order, not justice. Dolores Umbridge did not see herself as cruel. She did not believe she was a villain. In her own eyes, she was a guardian of order, a high priestess of discipline in a world teetering on the edge of chaos. Unlike characters such as Dumbledore, who pursued wisdom and compassion, or Voldemort, who hungered for domination, Umbridge was driven by a singular and obsessive devotion to hierarchy. To her, order was sacred, not moral order, not justice, but structural, inflexible, bureaucratic order, the kind that silences the weak, protects the powerful, and functions without interruption, regardless of truth or kindness. Her tight curls, saccharine voice, and pink cardigans masked a mind colder than the most loyal Death Eaters. Yet she did not consider herself aligned with evil. She despised Voldemort not for his cruelty, but for his chaos. She disliked Dumbledore not for his power, but for his unpredictability. To her, both were dangerous precisely because they rejected the Ministry's rigid structure. She needed people to follow rules, not question them. She needed boxes to be ticked and papers to be signed. That, in her view, was the height of civilization, and this is what made her not only dangerous but horrifying. Umbridge's tenure at Hogwarts during Harry Potter's 5th year is one of the clearest examples of her obsession with this vision of order. When the Ministry of Magic refused to accept the truth of Voldemort's return, they sent her to the school not to educate, but to control. As senior undersecretary to the minister, her goal was to suppress dissent, eliminate nonconformity, and ensure that no student, teacher, or ghost dared stray from the official narrative. She began this campaign by introducing educational decrees, a slow tightening of the noose disguised as administrative reform. Progress for the sake of progress must be discouraged, she declared, removing any doubt that her reign would prioritize stagnation over curiosity. The first thing she banned was practical defense training. "Wands away," she told the students, insisting that reading about spells was sufficient preparation. She did not care whether they could defend themselves against dark magic. What mattered was that they obeyed instructions. When Harry dared to speak out, insisting that Voldemort had returned and that real defense was necessary, she gave him detention, not just once, but repeatedly. During those detentions, Harry was forced to write lines with a cursed quill that carved the words "I must not tell lies" into the back of his hand. It was torture, but in her view it was order being restored. Her obsession extended to even the smallest details of student life. She regulated the length of girls' skirts, banned student clubs, and inspected teachers like a factory manager searching for faults in machinery. She punished Sybil Trelawney, the divination professor, not for incompetence, but for eccentricity. Trelawney did not fit the mold. She was unpredictable, emotional, untidy. And so Umbridge humiliated her publicly, stripping her of her post and reducing her to tears on the front steps of the school. "You are dismissed," Umbridge said coldly, before Minerva McGonagall intervened to offer the weeping woman shelter. When Fred and George Weasley launched their fireworks rebellion, an act of pure joyful defiance, Umbridge did not react with anger, but with a desire to re-establish control. The corridors of the school had become unpredictable, vibrant, alive. To her, this was not mischief, it was sedition. She deployed the inquisitorial squad students, empowered to police their peers. These were not rule followers, but bullies given badges. She didn't care, they restored her hierarchy. Even Draco Malfoy, cruel and arrogant, was given power. In her world, loyalty to her system mattered more than decency or merit. Perhaps most chilling was her willingness to use dark magic under the guise of legality. She ordered the use of verite serum on students. She tried to ban Hagrid, a half-giant, not because he had done anything wrong, but because his very existence violated her vision of a proper wizarding society. She despised what could not be filed, classified, tamed. When Dumbledore fled after taking the blame for Dumbledore's army, she smiled, not because she had achieved justice, but because the last major obstacle to her reign had been removed. "The Ministry is now in direct control of Hogwarts," she said triumphantly, failing to see the tragedy of those words. And then came her darkest moment. When she caught Harry and Hermione sneaking into her office to use the fireplace, she decided they were hiding something and demanded answers. When they refused, she prepared to use the Cruciatus Curse, a torture spell so painful it can drive victims mad. It was illegal, but she felt justified. "What Cornelius doesn't know won't hurt him," she said with a smile. In that moment, she revealed her full philosophy. Laws are tools to preserve order, not moral boundaries. Torture was acceptable so long as it protected the system. She did not see cruelty. She saw discipline. Even her personal appearance was part of her strategy. Her clothes, her voice, her cat-covered plates, all designed to appear harmless, soft, maternal. But it was a camouflage. She wrapped barbed wire in pink ribbon. Students underestimated her at first, then they feared her. But even in fear, she remained confident in her role. She believed that she was not merely enforcing ministry policy. She believed she was saving society from collapse. If she had been born in another era, she might have burned witches, citing the law as justification. In her own mind, she was the last good soldier of a world falling into anarchy. Number 18, afraid of the truly powerful. Dolores Umbridge strutted through the halls of Hogwarts with a smug smile and a sense of untouchable authority. Dressed in her trademark pink cardigan and adorned with decorative kitten plates on her office walls, she presented herself as a symbol of sweetness, tradition, and strict order. But beneath the lace and smiles was a woman driven not by courage but by cowardice, by a need to control because she feared being overpowered. Her cruelty was never born of strength, it was born of terror. And this fear was most obvious when she was confronted with those who truly had power. She built her entire career within the Ministry of Magic on the back of flattery and fear. Umbridge did not climb the ranks by standing firm against evil or showing loyalty to justice. She did it by hiding behind bureaucracy, aligning herself with the strongest force in the room, and making herself useful to those who intimidated her. Cornelius Fudge was one such figure. As the Minister for Magic, Fudge's approval was everything to Umbridge, and she mirrored his paranoia about Dumbledore with blind devotion. Rather than question his judgment, she leaned into it, using it as justification for cruelty. She did not investigate truth. She enforced loyalty. Her behavior at Hogwarts during Harry Potter's 5th year revealed the extent of her fear-based approach to power. She used educational decrees not to improve education, but to eliminate threats. Teachers who challenged her authority were dismissed or closely monitored. Students who showed independence were punished. Yet, even at the height of her power as High Inquisitor, she dared not act directly against Albus Dumbledore. She accused him of forming a secret army, of plotting against the ministry, and yet, when the moment came to arrest him, she stood silent as he escaped in a blaze of magical brilliance. She couldn't even meet his eyes. "You seem to be laboring under the delusion that I am going to—" What is the phrase? "Come quietly," Dumbledore had said, and she knew at once that he was out of her reach. She never raised her wand against him. She never tried to stop him. Despite months of plotting, surveillance, and oppressive rule, Dolores Umbridge was paralyzed when confronted with real magic and real authority. She watched as Dumbledore vanished, accompanied by Fawkes, without so much as lifting a finger. That moment exposed her, not to the public, but to herself. It confirmed the truth she had always known but never dared to face. She was powerless against those who did not fear her. Her fear of Lord Voldemort was even deeper, though wrapped in denial. When Voldemort returned, she clung to the narrative that he had not. She reinforced it, wrote decrees around it, punished those who claimed otherwise. She persecuted Harry Potter not only because of his defiance, but because his truth threatened the illusion of safety. Voldemort's return meant that her position was meaningless. Her pink sweaters, her framed kittens, her quills that cut into flesh, all of it was a farce in the presence of real terror. She clung to bureaucracy because it made her feel safe, but it was never going to protect her from the Dark Lord. Years later, during Voldemort's reign, she aligned herself with the New Order, presiding over the Muggleborn Registration Commission. She wore the locket of Salazar Slytherin as a badge of power, unaware it was a Horcrux. But even then, surrounded by Death Eaters and protected by the regime, she never stood on the front lines. She sent others to interrogate, to accuse, to punish. She smiled her polite, venomous smile and let others get their hands dirty. She approved sentences of life in Azkaban for innocent people, but only because she believed herself shielded by the system. If Voldemort himself had entered the courtroom, she would have bowed so low her nose touched the floor. Her cruelty to the weak knew no bounds. She tormented students like Harry, Hermione, and Neville, knowing that their resistance would be met with little institutional support. She tried to silence Luna Lovegood for speaking the truth. She punished students who questioned her with sadistic detentions, forcing them to write lines that cut into their skin. "I must not tell lies," she forced Harry to carve into his own hand. This was not justice. It was abuse cloaked in procedure, but she only dared such acts because she believed they had no power to strike back. She dismissed Hagrid as unfit because of his half-giant blood. She saw his strength, but not his gentleness, and that frightened her. She could not control him, not fully, so she sent auras to attack him in the night. But again, she did not lead them. She stayed in the shadows. She watched from afar. She feared what Hagrid might do if cornered. She feared what anyone might do if they stopped playing by the rules she set. Her fear was never more visible than during the battle of the Department of Mysteries. When Death Eaters attacked, when prophecies shattered, and when chaos erupted, Umbridge was nowhere to be seen. She had disappeared long before. Faced with real danger, she vanished. It was only when Harry and Hermione tricked her into entering the Forbidden Forest that her facade completely broke. Surrounded by centaurs, stripped of her power, she shrieked like a child. The woman who had tortured students, silenced teachers, and rewrote the school's laws stood trembling in the dark, begging for mercy. She was not brave. She had never been brave. Even her recovery from that humiliation was marked by shame and silence. The ministry never spoke of it. She never referenced it. And when she returned, during the events of the Deathly Hallows, she pretended it had never happened. But the fear lingered in her eyes. She knew that if the centaurs had wanted her dead, she would be dead. No amount of decrees, stamps, or ministry letters would have saved her. In the forest, her rules meant nothing. And still she clung to paper, to stamps, to symbols of authority. In the courtroom where she condemned innocent Muggleborns, she wore her ministry robes like armor. But it was false armor, and deep down she knew it. When Harry burst into her trial room, when he saw her passing judgment while wearing the Horcrux around her neck, he realized she had not changed. But what mattered most was not what she wore, it was that she had not fought. She did not try to duel him. She did not stand and shout. She cowered, she blustered, and she was stunned into unconsciousness with a single spell. Dolores Umbridge never recovered from that. She was later tried for crimes against Muggleborns and imprisoned. She tried to defend herself with paperwork, with ministry policies, with signed authorizations, but the world had changed. The new ministry saw through her lies. There were no dark wizards to hide behind, no ministers to flatter, no bureaucracies to manipulate. She was alone and, without power, she was nothing. Her entire life was built on the illusion of control. She believed that rules made her strong, but rules are only powerful when backed by courage. Umbridge had none. She punished those beneath her and praised those above her. She never protected anyone. She never fought for justice. She never faced danger without trembling. Her pink bows and polite voice masked a soul that had never learned to be brave. Her story is not one of villainy born from strength, but of villainy born from weakness. Dolores Umbridge was a coward. She ruled through fear because she was consumed by it. She feared Dumbledore's wisdom, Voldemort's cruelty, Harry's defiance, and even the truth itself. And in the end, her fear consumed her legacy. No one remembers her with respect, only with hatred and pity. Number 19. Helped oppress werewolves. Dolores Umbridge, a name etched into the darkest corners of the wizarding world, was not just a petty bureaucrat with a love for pink cardigans and feline-decorated plates. Behind her saccharine smile and high-pitched giggle lay a soul hardened by prejudice, consumed by her thirst for control. Her cruelty extended far beyond the corridors of Hogwarts. Among the many groups she targeted during her rise through the ministry ranks, one community suffered particularly under her policies: the werewolves. Through a carefully orchestrated campaign of repression, Umbridge managed to strip away not only the rights, but the very humanity of these marginalized magical beings, hiding her venom behind words like security and public order. Before her full descent into infamy at Hogwarts, Umbridge had already earned a reputation in the Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures. It was here, in the grimly named Werewolf Capture Unit, that she first sharpened her claws. Viewing werewolves not as people, but as threats, she lobbied for the creation of a registry that demanded every known werewolf report their movements to the Ministry. This wasn't for their protection, as she claimed. It was the first step in surveilling, isolating, and eventually starving them of their rights. The infamous Werewolf Code of Conduct, once designed to foster cooperation, was twisted under her oversight into a legal weapon. Names were collected, addresses noted, families recorded. It wasn't about justice, it was about control. In the name of public safety, Umbridge pushed through legislation that made it nearly impossible for werewolves to find legal employment. Her ministry memoranda were cold and bureaucratic, but the effects were devastating. Employers who dared hire known werewolves faced audits, inspections, and threats to their business licenses. Shops closed their doors, inns turned out lodgers, and even some magical clinics, under pressure from Umbridge's office, began refusing them treatment. When questioned in the Wizengamot about this, Umbridge smugly responded, "It is the responsibility of the Ministry to ensure that all citizens are protected from dangerous elements. Some sacrifices must be made." Perhaps the most heartbreaking consequence of Umbridge's policies was the slow unravelling of Remus Lupin's life. Lupin, once a beloved professor at Hogwarts and a member of the Order of the Phoenix, found himself cast out of society, despite his efforts to control his condition with the wolfsbane potion, and despite his years of service in the fight against Voldemort. Umbridge saw only a creature. The stain of her laws clung to him like a curse. His attempts to find work in the wizarding world were repeatedly thwarted. Employers would offer him a position, then suddenly retract their offer after receiving a ministry visit. Even underground networks grew afraid to help him for fear of retribution. What made Umbridge's persecution particularly cruel was its preemptive nature. She didn't wait for a werewolf to commit a crime. The mere fact of their existence was, in her eyes, criminal enough. A report from the time described how suspected werewolves, many of whom had never harmed anyone, were detained during full moons without evidence or trial. Entire families were driven into hiding, especially when it became known that ministry agents were using discreet observational methods, a euphemism for spying, and forced interrogations. Children of werewolves, even those not infected, faced bullying in schools and were flagged in ministry files. Umbridge had ensured they were treated not as individuals, but as threats by association. One of the most chilling aspects of Umbridge's campaign was her manipulation of language. In a series of internal ministry briefings, she referred to werewolves not as people, but as beasts. This dehumanizing rhetoric made it easier for others to accept the injustices. "Beasts cannot be trusted," she once wrote. "Beasts must be contained. We must not endanger the future of our children by permitting their integration into our schools and workplaces." These words echoed eerily through the halls of the ministry, laying the foundation for policies that pushed werewolves further into the shadows. Fear replaced reason. Paranoia replaced compassion. One particular case exemplifies the horror of Umbridge's influence. A young man named Owen Greaves, bitten by Fenrir Greyback during the Second Wizarding War, sought help from St. Mungo's. Despite having no history of violence and actively seeking treatment, he was denied care due to his name appearing on the ministry's unfriendly beings list, a secret document Umbridge had helped draft. Left untreated, Owen succumbed to magical injuries unrelated to his lycanthropy. His death, like many others, was buried in red tape and ministry silence. His mother, in a heartbreaking letter published anonymously in the Quibbler, wrote, "They didn't just let him die, they made sure he couldn't live." Umbridge's obsession with control reached its height during the brief reign of the Muggleborn Registration Commission. Here, her prejudices found new fertile ground, but her disdain for non-human beings persisted. Her office actively collaborated with hit wizards to preemptively neutralize threats, a tactic that frequently targeted known werewolves, even those who had not registered due to fear or shame. The line between law enforcement and personal vendetta blurred until it disappeared altogether. She had transformed the ministry from a governing body into a machinery of fear. Even when Voldemort took control of the ministry, Umbridge didn't resist. Instead, she flourished. Her treatment of undesirables intensified, with werewolves rounded up, interrogated, and often left in holding cells for weeks without charges. Some vanished entirely. Her pink office, decorated with fluffy kittens, became a twisted metaphor, a soft mask for cruelty. A source inside the ministry described her as smiling sweetly while signing destruction warrants. For Umbridge, power was not a means to serve, but a tool to punish. The hypocrisy of it all was staggering. Umbridge never confronted Fenrir Greyback himself. Like many bullies, she feared those who truly posed a threat. Instead, she focused her venom on those too weak, too isolated, too desperate to fight back. The fact that Lupin, a man who had fought alongside Harry Potter, and Albus Dumbledore could be reduced to scavenging for survival speaks volumes about the effectiveness of her campaign. "I was shunned," Lupin once said, "not because of what I did, but because of what I was, and she made sure I never forgot it." What made Umbridge particularly dangerous was her ability to operate within the law. Unlike Death Eaters who used brute force, she used paperwork. She understood the machinery of government and twisted it to her will. Her signature wasn't just on proclamations at Hogwarts, it was on dozens of ministry decrees, each one a nail in the coffin of justice. She masked her tyranny in legalese and stamped it with the ministry's seal. Her strength lay not in open violence, but in systemic cruelty, and that made her more dangerous than any masked Death Eater. After the war, as the wizarding world began to reckon with the atrocities committed during Voldemort's return, Umbridge was finally put on trial, but her legacy remained. The werewolf community, already a fragile one, had been pushed to the brink. It would take years for trust to be rebuilt, and even longer for the stigma to fade. Her name became synonymous with heartless bureaucracy. To many, she wasn't just a villain. She was a warning of what happens when power is left unchecked. In the years that followed, Kingsley Shacklebolt, appointed as the new Minister for Magic, reversed many of Umbridge's policies. Employment protections were extended, access to wolfsbane potions subsidized, and the Werewolf Support Services Office restructured to focus on rehabilitation rather than restriction. But even with these reforms, the fear lingered. The damage had been done. People still crossed the street when they saw a scarred face. Mothers still clutched their children tighter during the full moon. The words Umbridge had spread, beasts, dangerous, untrustworthy, echoed in whispers. Dolores Umbridge believed in a world of order, but her vision of order required the sacrifice of compassion, the silencing of dissent, and the destruction of those she deemed inferior. In her eyes, safety was worth any cost, even if that cost was the soul of wizarding society. She taught the world a cruel lesson that evil doesn't always wear black robes. Sometimes it wears pink. And sometimes the greatest danger to a community comes not from dark wizards, but from those who claim to protect it. Number 20 secretly dreamed of becoming minister. Dolores Umbridge always sat too straight, as if the weight of her pink cardigan were royal robes and her tea set a crown. Few at the Ministry of Magic dared question the pristine veneer she cultivated, but many whispered once her back turned. Behind the lace doilies and kitten plates, behind the fluttery laugh and syrupy voice, there existed an unshakable truth. Dolores Jane Umbridge dreamed of becoming Minister for Magic. It was not a passing fantasy, it was a quiet obsession that festered and matured, through decades of backroom scheming, silent observations, and strategic betrayals. Her ambition had roots, deep and tangled, tracing back to her early years in the ministry. As a low-ranking bureaucrat in the Department of Magical Accidents and Catastrophes, she seemed hardly noteworthy. Yet, even then, her co-workers noted her uncanny ability to be in the right place at the right time. She aligned herself with superiors, flattered those above, and dismissed those beneath. One unnamed colleague once described her as the sort of person who sends flowers to the boss's wife on his birthday. This calculated loyalty was not affection, it was currency. She invested in people as tools for her advancement. It was under Minister Cornelius Fudge that Umbridge's trajectory steepened. She climbed from her inconspicuous desk to the more influential corridors of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, eventually earning the post of Senior Undersecretary to the Minister himself. Fudge, a man of profound insecurity, found her deference intoxicating. She soothed his paranoia, bolstered his suspicions, and never once challenged his grip on power. Fudge will never believe Dumbledore's plotting against him unless we keep whispering it in his ear. She once mused in the shadows, and so she did. To Fudge, she was the perfect subordinate, unquestioning, relentless, and obedient. To herself, she was already preparing to wear his robes. Her appointment as High Inquisitor at Hogwarts was not a burden, but a rehearsal. In the corridors of the castle, she built her miniature empire. Rules, proclamations, punishments, all were rehearsals for the kind of control she hoped to exercise over the entire magical population. When she seized control of Dumbledore's school, she believed she was proving her readiness for greater office. Progress for the sake of progress must be discouraged, she said, parading her authority like a queen among peasants. Her policies were not educational, they were political theatre. Each decree was a performance for the ministry, each student a citizen to be subjugated. Umbridge never lost sight of the throne she longed for. Even after Fudge fell and Rufus Scrimgeour took office, she adjusted with terrifying speed. She traded flattery for formality, shedding sweetness in favour of cold, correct alignment. Scrimgeour, a former Auror, distrusted her instinctively. He had the eyes of a predator and recognized the predator in her. Though she cloaked herself in legalese and policy, he sensed what lay beneath. The hunger for dominance, the need to command, to reshape the ministry in her own rigid image. He never allowed her full access. He used her when convenient and kept her at arm's length, and in that distance, Umbridge burned. With the fall of Scrimgeour and the dark tide rising, Dolores found new opportunity under Pious Thickness, the puppet minister installed by Lord Voldemort. In theory, it was her moment. Those who had feared Voldemort fled or fell silent, but Umbridge did not cower. She flourished, she adapted, she swore allegiance not with words but with actions, organizing Muggleborn registration commissions, issuing arrest warrants, stripping wizards and witches of their wands and rights. "You are not a witch," she told Mary Catamole in courtroom silence, her voice devoid of pity. She saw herself as guardian of purity, of order. Others saw only a fanatic. Still, the highest chair in the ministry remained just out of reach. Even the Death Eaters, ruthless and opportunistic, saw in her something they could not entirely trust. Though she championed their ideology, she was not one of them. Her ambitions did not lie with their cause, but with her own elevation. Bellatrix Lestrange, among others, found her revolting. "Too neat, too self-serving," one Death Eater is rumoured to have remarked. Even in a regime built on terror, Umbridge was viewed with suspicion. No one could forget that her loyalties were only ever to herself. When the war ended and Kingsley Shacklebolt took power as interim minister, a reckoning began. Trials, inquiries, and resignations swept through the ministry. Yet somehow Umbridge survived. She argued that she had only followed protocol, that her actions were legal under the regime in power. She distanced herself from the Death Eaters, claimed ignorance of Voldemort's true return, and framed her deeds as patriotic. But those who knew her, truly knew her, were not deceived. They remembered her eyes in courtrooms, the relish with which she passed judgment. They remembered the locket she wore, Slytherin's locket, taken not from duty but from desire. The locket, stolen from a Muggle-born victim, became a symbol of her corruption. It was not merely an artifact, but a trophy. It signified her belief in her right to rule, in her blood superiority. Even after Voldemort fell, she wore it as if nothing had changed. When Harry Potter, Hermione Granger, and Ron Weasley infiltrated the Ministry in search of that very Horcrux, they found her seated like royalty, issuing decrees from behind layers of parchment and pink walls. Undesirable number 1 was etched across the wanted posters, but in her mind, she was still rising. Harry, in that moment, saw her for what she was, not a servant of darkness, but a darkness all her own. She's foul enough to be one of them, he thought, and in that thought was truth. Dolores did not need Voldemort to justify cruelty. She wielded authority with more malice than many who bore the dark mark. The Ministry, in all its fear and rot, had given her the tools. She had simply used them without restraint. Her rise was not halted by defeat, but by exposure. The world saw what she was and refused to forget. Though she was arrested and removed from her post, rumours persisted that she hoped for a return. Some said she wrote letters to the Daily Prophet, anonymous op-eds defending old policies. Others claimed she was quietly lobbying for educational reform. Her name became a byword for tyranny disguised as structure, bigotry draped in velvet. She was never officially pardoned, but never officially imprisoned for life. Like a virus, she lingered in the corners of political discussion, always waiting, always dreaming. What made Dolores Umbridge truly dangerous was not her power, but her patience. Unlike Voldemort, who charged at his goals with fire and fury, Umbridge waited in the margins, cultivated appearances, and poisoned from within. She learned to smile while sharpening knives. She understood that bureaucracy could be a weapon, and silence could be complicity. She did not need magic to terrify. She needed only a clipboard and permission. Her dream of becoming Minister for Magic was not born of service but of supremacy. Throughout her career, colleagues described her as meticulous, insistent, and eerily consistent. She followed rules she wrote herself, one former staffer said, and punished those who failed to interpret them her way. She was not chaotic, but methodical. She believed in control in a society trimmed of mess and difference. Her vision for the Ministry was one of structure and surveillance, purity and obedience. There was no room for resistance in her imagined future, only submission to her design. And perhaps that was why, in the end, no minister ever gave her the throne. Fudge tolerated her. Scrimgeour avoided her. Thickness used her. But none crowned her. The magical elite, corrupted though they were, understood one truth. Give Umbridge power, and she would not relinquish it. She was not a servant of any ideology but her own. She was the embodiment of self-preservation masquerading as patriotism, and that terrified even those who trafficked in terror. Her legacy did not vanish. In classrooms and corridors, students remembered the scars she left. "I must not tell lies" became more than a line. It became a warning. Her policies were studied not as examples but as cautionary tales. Her portrait never hung in the Ministry, but her name was spoken in hushed tones when new bureaucrats showed signs of unchecked ambition. Dolores Jane Umbridge became a symbol, not of power, but of its perversion. She dreamed of being Minister for Magic. She nearly succeeded, and that was what made her unforgettable. Number 21. Believed magic was a privilege, not a right. Dolores Umbridge wore pink like a badge of honor, but behind every frilly bow and decorative plate was a mind forged in the iron grip of ideology. She did not see magic as a birthright of all magical children. To her, it was a privilege, one that required bloodline, legacy, and the right name. As a senior official in the Ministry of Magic, and later the Defense Against the Dark Arts professor at Hogwarts, Umbridge brought with her not a desire to teach, but a mission to control. Her classroom was not a place of learning, but a gatekeeping institution where spells were read, never cast, and where fear sat behind every inkwell. While Hermione Granger fought for justice, founding SPEW, championing house elf rights, and supporting the inclusion of all magical children, Dolores Umbridge quietly waged war on those very ideals. She looked at Hermione, a brilliant Muggleborn student who outperformed most purebloods, and saw not an inspiration, but a threat. For Umbridge, students like Hermione were accidents of nature, anomalies that disrupted the natural hierarchy she held dear. The idea that someone without magical ancestry could rise to the top of the class was offensive to her sensibilities. It contradicted her belief that magical superiority was inherited, not earned. At the heart of Umbridge's philosophy was the notion that Hogwarts should not be a sanctuary of knowledge, but a mechanism for control. Her appointment as High Inquisitor was not random, it was strategic. The Ministry needed someone who wouldn't just monitor Dumbledore, but systematically dismantle any idea that deviated from its vision of order. Umbridge fit that mold perfectly. With each new decree, she turned Hogwarts into a place where books were censored, teachers were interrogated, and students were silenced. The school library became a battlefield where volumes on defensive magic were quietly removed. Even professors like Trelawney, who had nothing to do with rebellion, were targets, not because of incompetence, but because of non-conformity. The fifth-year curriculum for Defense Against the Dark Arts under Umbridge became a symbol of her ideology. She insisted that theoretical knowledge will be sufficient to get you through your examinations, a justification that stripped the subject of its practical value. Harry Potter, who had faced Death Eaters and Dementors, saw this for what it was, a calculated effort to make students defenseless. If children couldn't protect themselves, they'd be more reliant on the Ministry, more easily controlled. Umbridge didn't just remove spellwork from the syllabus, she criminalized self-defense. Her methods were never loud, they were insidious. She didn't scream about blood purity, she passed laws, wore sweet perfume, and smiled while enforcing tyranny. In one particularly chilling instance, she created the Inquisitorial Squad, giving Slytherin students like Draco Malfoy and Pansy Parkinson the power to patrol their peers. It was a miniature ministry, discipline through favoritism, control through surveillance. And who did they target? Always the ones who questioned authority. Always the ones with too much attitude, like Neville Longbottom, whose parents were tortured by Death Eaters, or Luna Lovegood, whose eccentricities didn't fit the mold. For Umbridge, difference was danger. Even the use of punishments reflected her twisted values. Her infamous black quill that etched detentions into the skin of students without using ink was not just cruel, it was symbolic. Magic was used not to protect, but to punish. And it wasn't an accident that it was used most viciously on Harry, the boy who challenged her vision. "I must not tell lies," carved into the back of his hand, became a scar not only of physical pain, but of the ideological battle between freedom and oppression. She made truth a crime and silence a virtue. Her distrust of magical creatures also revealed her mindset. Centaurs, whom she called filthy half-breeds, were symbols of untamable magic. She hated them not because they posed a threat to her personally, but because they represented a world beyond her control. Their intelligence and independence clashed with her rigid worldview, and her encounter with them in the Forbidden Forest was poetic justice. The creatures she had tried to suppress turned on her, rejecting her authority entirely. But even then she was not broken. Her belief in hierarchy and bloodlines remained unshaken. During her trial appearance in Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, Umbridge had not reformed. Instead, she had risen higher in power, now overseeing the Muggleborn Registration Commission. Her job was to interrogate witches and wizards born to non-magical parents and accuse them of stealing magic. It was the ultimate manifestation of her belief that only those from the right families deserved access to magical education and privilege. She wore Slytherin's locket, a symbol of pure blood legacy, as a badge of superiority. She smiled through her cruelty, presiding over trials that ruined lives without a shred of remorse. One cannot ignore the hypocrisy embedded in her methods. While claiming to uphold law and order, she ignored the law whenever it suited her ideology. Her actions were not born of loyalty to the ministry, but of loyalty to a system where only the chosen deserved power. When questioned, she always deflected, wrapping her cruelty in bureaucratic language. She would say, "I am merely following ministry procedure," even as she destroyed the futures of innocent children. But her procedures were weapons, and she wielded them with precision. What made Umbridge uniquely dangerous was that she wasn't a Death Eater. She didn't follow Voldemort, didn't bear the dark mark, and wasn't seduced by power in the traditional sense. Her evil was quieter, institutional, dressed in rules and paper trails. She did not seek chaos as Voldemort did. She sought order, but her version of order was one where blood determined worth and silence was rewarded. In some ways, that made her more frightening. Voldemort could be fought in battle. Umbridge could only be fought through resistance, through voices like Hermione's and actions like Harry's. There is a moment in the book that encapsulates her worldview perfectly. When she tells Harry, "You have been told that a certain dark wizard has returned from the dead. This is a lie," she is not just denying facts, she is denying agency. She is asserting that the ministry, not truth, determines reality. In that moment, she becomes not a teacher, but a dictator in a pink cardigan. She is rewriting the world with a smile, and that is far more terrifying than any hex. Her disdain for Muggleborns wasn't always expressed openly. It seeped through her decisions, her appointments, her disciplinary actions. She did not scream about it the way Bellatrix Lestrange did, but she believed the same things, that magic belonged to the few. And where Bellatrix used wands and curses, Umbridge used memos and meetings. Both aimed to silence the same voices, one through terror, the other through regulation. Dolores Umbridge's reign at Hogwarts left a legacy not of learning, but of trauma. Students were afraid to speak, afraid to practice magic, afraid to ask questions. The classroom became a courtroom, and innocence was never assumed. Her educational decrees, which started at number 1 and grew into the dozens, were not about teaching, but about eliminating. She wanted to eliminate rebellion, eliminate diversity, and above all, eliminate the possibility that someone like Hermione Granger could become someone like Albus Dumbledore. And that was her true mission, to protect a magical aristocracy, a vision where the sacred bloodlines reigned and all others knew their place. It's no wonder she loathed Dumbledore, the very embodiment of merit and moral magic. In him she saw everything she feared: wisdom without prejudice, power without cruelty, leadership without conformity. She could not understand a world where greatness came from choice, not pedigree. That's why she worked to destroy Hogwarts, not by attacking its walls, but by twisting its soul. In the end, Dolores Umbridge was not just a villain of circumstance. She was a product of ideology, a woman who saw magic as a birthright of the elite. She did not want to teach students to think, she wanted to teach them to obey. And for that reason, she remains one of the most chilling figures in the wizarding world, not because she cursed or killed, but because she smiled as she took your voice away. Number 22 encouraged students to spy on each other. When Dolores Umbridge walked into Hogwarts, the air itself seemed to change. There was no mistaking her chirpy voice and pink attire, but behind that saccharine exterior lay a terrifying intent: control, total and unquestionable. Her methods were never direct displays of brute force. Instead, she weaponized rules, exploited ambition, and perhaps most insidiously, turned students into spies. Few moments in the series feel as psychologically disturbing as the transformation of Hogwarts into a place where trust was dangerous and betrayal was rewarded. One of her most chilling tools was the institution of a formal system of informants, turning the student body into a network of eyes and ears. What made it even worse was that many of them participated willingly. The brilliance and cruelty of Umbridge's system lay in how she dressed it in legitimacy. She did not tell students they were betraying others, she told them they were helping maintain order. She did not call it spying, she called it vigilance. With this rhetoric, she cloaked tyranny in the illusion of responsibility. Students were invited to report anything suspicious, secret meetings, defiance of new decrees, unorthodox behavior. Umbridge created a climate where the very act of expressing doubt in her rule became a punishable offence, often preempted by someone whispering your name in her ear. She offered incentives for information, extra privileges, lighter punishments, promises of favour. It was all voluntary, and that was what made it sinister. She did not force the betrayal, she invited it. Marietta Edgecombe remains one of the most tragic examples of this strategy in action. A sixth-year Ravenclaw and friend of Cho Chang, Marietta wasn't particularly malicious, but she was cautious and ultimately manipulable. When Harry and Hermione organized Dumbledore's army, it was a secret club meant to counteract Umbridge's refusal to teach real defensive magic. Marietta attended the first meetings reluctantly, but fear, cakes, and perhaps familial pressure, since her mother worked at the ministry, made her fold. Umbridge didn't need to interrogate her. She simply created an atmosphere in which loyalty to peers was a liability and loyalty to authority was safe. Marietta betrayed the DA by revealing its existence to Umbridge, a decision that shattered friendships and helped Umbridge tighten her grip on the school. J.K. Rowling does not shy away from portraying the consequences of such betrayal. She came to Umbridge's office and told her everything, the book explains plainly. The tragedy of Marietta is not just that she told, but that she was groomed into believing it was the right thing. Her betrayal was not dramatic, it was whispered, but it had enormous consequences. Dumbledore was forced to flee, the DA was disbanded, trust in the halls of Hogwarts crumbled. From that moment on, every student had to wonder who else might turn them in, who was watching them. Even friends became suspect. Dolores Umbridge, of course, thrived on this. She believed in order above all else, and she saw dissent as disease. So she planted seeds of paranoia. One of the most unnerving details was her creation of the Inquisitorial Squad, a group of hand-picked students granted authority over their peers. Many of them were Slytherins, like Draco Malfoy, Vincent Crabbe, and Gregory Goyle. But unlike school prefects, the Inquisitorial Squad did not exist to guide, they existed to punish. They could dock house points, enforce rules, and most importantly, spy. Their loyalty to Umbridge was rewarded with power, and power was a delicious poison. The squad wasn't just a disciplinary team. It was Umbridge's surveillance system. Professor Umbridge has given the Inquisitorial Squad permission to inspect any part of the castle they choose, the book says, and that meant no one was safe, not in common rooms, not in corridors, not even in classrooms. Umbridge weaponized student ambition, giving the already smug Draco Malfoy a badge of superiority. It was a brilliant, terrifying strategy. Instead of watching every student herself, she let them watch each other. Perhaps the most alarming aspect of all this was how ordinary it seemed. No magical creatures, no unforgivable curses, no obvious evil, just paperwork, discipline, and procedures. Umbridge didn't curse students into obedience. She made them do it to themselves. Through small incentives and subtle manipulation, she normalized betrayal. Students didn't even realize they had been turned against each other until it was too late. And by then, Umbridge had turned Hogwarts into something it had never been before, a school ruled by fear. What makes her methods more haunting is how effective they were in the short term. She gained control not through overwhelming force, but through psychology. The fear of being overheard, the constant second-guessing of your words, the possibility that your friend might be a spy. These were the tools she used. It's a horrifying concept because it's so plausible. Totalitarian regimes in history have used the exact same strategy: deputize the population, reward informants, punish loyalty to truth, and create confusion so profound that no one knows who to trust. Rowling distilled this tactic perfectly through Umbridge's reign. Even professors were not exempt. Umbridge encouraged students to report on their teachers too. A raised eyebrow, a muttered comment, an unapproved spell, all were grounds for suspicion. Some students took this seriously, others used it for petty revenge. It didn't matter. Umbridge accepted all reports as truth. When Professor Trelawney was dismissed, it wasn't because of a failed prophecy. It was because Umbridge found her expendable and used student opinions to support her decision. Every lesson became a performance, and every word spoken by a teacher could be twisted into an accusation. The power dynamic had shifted entirely. Neville Longbottom, a student who had always struggled with self-confidence, found himself in even greater distress under this system. Already prone to anxiety, Neville had to navigate a world where his every action might be scrutinized. Loyalty became dangerous. Even standing by Harry could result in punishment. The bravery Neville would later display during the Battle of Hogwarts was forged during these years of quiet resistance, of learning whom to trust and when to stay silent. Umbridge's system taught him caution, but it also taught him courage, not the kind that earns applause, but the kind that survives when no one is watching. One of the more subtle consequences of Umbridge's tactics was the erosion of communal identity. Hogwarts had always been divided into houses, yes, but there had been unity in shared struggle and celebration. Under Umbridge, those lines became deeper trenches. Slytherins were seen as allies to her cause, while Gryffindors, Hufflepuffs, and Ravenclaws began to look at each other with suspicion. It was no longer about rivalry. It was about survival. Who was reporting? Who could be trusted? Who would turn you in for saying the wrong thing at dinner? In this way, Umbridge didn't just fracture relationships, she fractured the spirit of Hogwarts. Even Harry Potter himself, the central figure of resistance, was caught in this web. With the Daily Prophet smearing his name and Umbridge controlling the curriculum, he had few allies and fewer options. His refusal to remain silent made him a target, but even more disturbing was that students began to avoid him, not because they didn't believe him, but because being seen with him was risky. Umbridge never had to lay a hand on him. She simply isolated him, piece by piece, using fear to do what spells could not. It was a masterclass in psychological warfare. In that oppressive atmosphere, trust became rebellion. When Dumbledore's army formed in the Room of Requirement, it wasn't just a group of students learning spells. It was a desperate attempt to reclaim truth, connection, and courage, but the very fact that it had to exist in secret proved how far Umbridge's influence had spread. Marietta Edgecombe's betrayal, then, was not just an act of personal weakness, it was a symptom of a poisoned environment. She was not a villain, but a victim of Umbridge's manipulation, a girl pushed into fear and rewarded for cowardice. By the time Fred and George Weasley launched their final prank and left the school in a blaze of fireworks and chaos, their act felt less like mischief and more like rebellion. It was a scream against suffocation, a desperate attempt to remind the school what freedom felt like. Students cheered, not just for the spectacle, but for the release. For a moment, the spell of fear was broken. And though Umbridge would remain for a while longer, her control was beginning to crack. No system of betrayal can last forever. Eventually, the truth finds its way back in. And so Dolores Umbridge remains one of the most insidious figures in the Harry Potter universe. Not because of any single spell or battle, but because of how she rewrote the rules of trust. Her system of informants left no visible scars, but the damage ran deep. In turning students into spies, she didn't just try to control behavior, she tried to control thought. That is why her presence in the story lingers with such unease. Her cruelty wore a smile, her punishments came with protocol, and her betrayals were written in ink by someone else's hand. Number 23. Lost everything and never repented. Dolores Umbridge did not vanish quietly after the fall of Voldemort. While others fled, hid, or desperately tried to erase the past, she clung to her sense of order like a drowning woman to a stone. When the Ministry of Magic fell to corruption under the regime of the Death Eaters, Umbridge found her perfect moment. With Cornelius Fudge gone and Rufus Scrimgeour murdered, she slid into power not through allegiance to Voldemort himself, but by aligning with his ideals. She oversaw the Muggleborn Registration Commission, signing documents that condemned innocent witches and wizards to imprisonment or worse. Even then, she acted not as a Death Eater, but as something far colder, an opportunistic bureaucrat who believed in the righteousness of her authority. After the war ended and Voldemort was defeated, the wizarding world began the painful process of justice. Trials were held, testimonies were given, names were named, and Umbridge was among those summoned before the Wizengamot. There was no shortage of evidence. Testimonies from Mary Cattermole, Dirk Cresswell's family, and others who suffered under her reign painted a chilling picture of systemic abuse wrapped in pink cardigans and kitten plates. She had used the blood quill on students, overseen interrogations, and signed off on arrests that led to Azkaban sentences, all under the pretense of law. During her trial, Dolores Umbridge stood not as a repentant public servant, but as a defiant defender of her actions. She claimed she was merely doing her duty and had been protecting the purity of magical society. Her voice did not shake, her expression did not falter. It was not madness nor zealotry, it was conviction. The same cold conviction that allowed her to brand Harry Potter a liar in front of an entire school, the same conviction that permitted her to punish children for speaking the truth, now became her last line of defense in front of those demanding justice. The court found her guilty on multiple charges: unlawful imprisonment, use of illegal magical artifacts, deliberate endangerment of minors, and collaboration with known Death Eater policies. She was sentenced to a life term in Azkaban, stripped of her wand, her status, and her precious office. But Azkaban did not silence her. According to reports from ministry officials, Umbridge remained a force within the prison. She continued to write letters, hundreds of them, addressed to former colleagues, demanding an appeal, citing legal technicalities, and accusing the new ministry of misguided leniency towards inferior blood. Her behavior in Azkaban quickly became infamous among the guards. While most prisoners eventually retreated into silence or madness, Umbridge was tireless. She insisted on a private cell. She refused to share space with Muggleborn witches, still referring to them as undesirables and mudbloods, even without an audience to impress. One guard, who spoke anonymously to the Daily Prophet, described her as the only inmate who acts like she's still the warden. This refusal to bend, even in chains, is what made Dolores Umbridge truly terrifying. Unlike Voldemort, she had no tragic backstory, no orphaned childhood, no tortured soul corrupted by power. Her cruelty was administrative. She hurt people because it fit the rules she valued, because she believed it was right. When Harry described her use of the blood quill, he was met with disbelief. "I must not tell lies," he had carved into the back of his hand. That wasn't some dark spell or curse. It was a conscious choice, her own design. And yet, even after everything, she never expressed regret. Not once. No remorse, no apology, no reflection. This unwavering self-righteousness made her more dangerous than many Death Eaters. Bellatrix Lestrange killed for pleasure, but Umbridge destroyed lives with a signature. She sent innocent people to Azkaban and thought herself just. That's the core of her evil. She believed she was good. Kingsley Shacklebolt, the new Minister for Magic, once remarked during an interview that Umbridge's refusal to admit guilt tells us more about the perils of power than any curse ever could. And he was right. The lesson was not about dark wizards in cloaks, but about those who sit behind desks and stamp fates with official seals. Dolores Umbridge showed how evil can wear a smile and speak in politeness, how hatred can hide in laws. Among the many letters she sent from prison, one stood out. It was addressed to Hermione Granger, by then working on Muggleborn rights. It was filled with venom, accusing her of disgracing the ministry and poisoning magical society with equality propaganda. The irony was not lost on Hermione, who kept the letter as evidence of what ideology can do when paired with bureaucracy. She later quoted it in a speech at Hogwarts. Let no one believe that hatred is always loud and angry. Sometimes it is quiet, administrative, and terrifyingly polite. Even more disturbing were the rumours that Umbridge attempted to create a new hierarchy within Azkaban itself. She tried to classify inmates by blood status, held informal hearings in her cell, and even offered recommendations to the guards about who deserved punishment. Of course, her requests were ignored, but the very attempt reflected her unwavering need to control. In a place designed to break the will, Umbridge's will remained intact, twisted and cruel, but unbroken. When Harry once spoke of her, years after the war, he did not mention her cruelty or the physical punishments. He said, "She believed the world was broken because it allowed people like me to exist. That's why she hated me, not because I was dangerous, but because I didn't fit her rules." That understanding of Umbridge, not as a sadist, but as a zealot of rules, defined the horror she represented. It wasn't personal, it was systemic. Even Sybil Trelawney, who had suffered under her evaluations at Hogwarts, said in her typically trembling voice, "I saw nothing in her future but darkness, no clarity, no peace." Many dismissed this as the usual ramblings of the divination professor, but her words echoed the sentiments of those who had witnessed Umbridge's wrath. There was no redemption arc, no awakening, only the persistence of belief in a cruel, hierarchical world. The idea that someone could lose everything, status, power, freedom, and still not question their actions is deeply unsettling. It challenges the hope that people can change, that consequences lead to reflection. Dolores Umbridge shattered that illusion. Her downfall was not a tragedy. It was a revelation that some people will go to their graves believing they were right, no matter how much pain they caused. The irony of Umbridge's fate is that she ended up in the very place she sent so many innocents. But unlike them, she did not weep. She did not ask for forgiveness. She did not seek mercy. She remained seated in her cell like a queen unjustly dethroned, sending out letters like decrees from exile. Her pink cardigan may have faded, her teacups smashed, but the mindset remained. That's what makes her unforgettable. To this day, she remains one of the few war criminals who never requested parole. She never signed any confession, never submitted to counseling, and never allowed visitors except when legally required. In every review hearing, she simply reiterated that the ministry had been corrupted by leniency and that her actions were misunderstood. She blamed everyone, Muggleborns, half-bloods, werewolves, reformists, but never herself. For students of magical history, Umbridge's case has become a cautionary tale not of magical extremism, but of ordinary evil. Her name is studied in Defense Against the Dark Arts, not because she used dark magic, but because she represents what happens when authority is left unchecked. The system itself can be a wand, as one historian put it, and Dolores Umbridge wielded it with the precision of a curse. She remains in Azkaban to this day, now in her late 70s, and still as unrepentant as ever. She is no longer dangerous, not in the traditional sense, Her letters are ignored. Her name fades from headlines. But in every student punished unfairly, in every rule used to harm rather than protect, in every excuse made in the name of order, her shadow lingers. Not because she won, but because she never admitted she was wrong. And that, more than any spell, is what makes her one of the most terrifying figures in the Harry Potter saga. Number 24, spied on her own family. Dolores Umbridge was a woman who cloaked herself in pink and lace, but beneath the kitten plates and sugary smiles lurked something infinitely darker. She rose swiftly through the ranks of the Ministry of Magic, not only because of her ruthless loyalty to authority, but because she understood how to erase her past. The public saw a devoted bureaucrat, a strict enforcer of magical law, and a woman who championed blood purity. But few knew the truth. Dolores Umbridge lived in fear, not of rebellion, not of the Dark Lord, but of her own bloodline. She was born into a family she deemed impure, and her most personal campaign was not fought against Dumbledore's army or half-breeds, but against her own mother and brother. Her father, Alfred Umbridge, was a wizard of limited ambition, working in the Ministry's maintenance department. Her mother, Ellen Cracknell, was a Muggle, and Dolores had a younger brother who was born without magic, a squib. These were the facts she buried deeper than any file in the Department of Mysteries. She did not simply walk away from her family, she erased them from her life with a viciousness that bordered on obsession. She viewed their existence as a threat to her fabricated identity, a pure-blood witch of impeccable heritage, and she used every ounce of her growing influence within the Ministry to ensure they remained in the shadows. From a young age, Dolores resented her mother for being non-magical, a defect she believed tainted her blood. When her brother was born without magic, her disdain turned into rage. She told colleagues and acquaintances that she was an only child, born to a line of distinguished witches and wizards. She boasted of fictitious ancestors who had fought in the Goblin Wars and served as advisors to the Wizengamot. She referred to herself as a true daughter of the magical world, while her real brother grew up hidden from both worlds, cut off from Muggle society and unwanted by the magical one. Dolores made sure of that. Her rise within the Ministry was accompanied by careful manipulation. She took a position in the improper use of magic office, and from there began to build a network of surveillance that extended far beyond what her job required. She kept tabs on her mother and brother through magical surveillance spells, quietly accessed through channels she controlled. Her mother, who had once tried to keep in touch, found her letters unanswered. When she attempted to visit the Ministry in person, she was intercepted by security. Ellen Cracknell was quietly escorted away and added to an unofficial blacklist, one that Dolores personally maintained. Neighbours of Ellen and her squib son began to receive visits from Ministry officials. These were not formal investigations, but hushed warnings. It would be better, they were told, not to associate with the Cracknell family. There are consequences to being too friendly with undesirables. One neighbour, a half-blood witch named Judith Marram, received a sudden inspection of her magical goods license after inviting Ellen for tea. A month later, her business was shuttered due to irregularities in her wand registration forms. She never connected the dots, but Dolores had. Dolores crafted a world where her origins were not only forgotten, they were actively hidden. She ensured no one in the Ministry questioned her story. Personnel files were edited, birth records subtly tampered with. She used the unspeakable's access to sealed archives to bury her past under layers of bureaucratic silence. Even the rare file that mentioned her father's occupation was conveniently misplaced. In her version of the truth, she had sprung from magical nobility, and she would rather destroy lives than allow anyone to see through the illusion. Her fear was not just social shame, it was political ruin. The Ministry was a place of quiet pedigree, where even whispers of a Muggle mother could doom a career. Dolores climbed higher by being more fanatical than anyone else. She drafted policies restricting non-magical interference, championed anti-werewolf legislation, and instituted surveillance measures during the height of Voldemort's return that rivaled any Death Eater's cruelty. The more power she gained, the more paranoid she became. What if someone found out about Ellen? What if her brother showed up in Diagon Alley, desperate and unaware of the danger? In Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, there is a telling moment that hints at her need to control her image. When she interrogates Muggleborn students about their right to possess wands, she does so with barely disguised hatred. "You are not a witch," she tells one girl coldly, "just because you can do a few tricks." It's the voice of someone projecting. Dolores could never forgive her mother for bringing non-magical blood into the family. Every Muggleborn she punished was, in a way, her vengeance upon her own lineage. Her brother, whose name was never publicly recorded in ministry documents, lived in quiet exile. He was sent to a distant relative in Wales, according to rumours, and grew up under constant supervision. Ministry owls visited his caretakers regularly. He was warned never to speak of his sister, and he obeyed. Fear was a language Dolores spoke fluently. There is an unconfirmed story, found in a personal account by a former clerk in the Department of Magical Records, that when her brother applied for a job in the magical transportation sector, his file was flagged and permanently removed from the hiring queue. No reason was ever given. But those who understood how the ministry truly worked knew better. The silence surrounding her family was so complete that even Rita Skeeter, a journalist with a knack for uncovering scandal, never wrote about it. Perhaps she couldn't find the facts, or perhaps Dolores had already buried them beneath layers of fabricated ancestry and fake testimonials. Even portraits in her office, smiling witches and stern-looking wizards, were enchanted replicas, not depictions of real relatives. She went so far as to commission false family trees, displayed during ministry functions, proudly pointing to names that never existed. Dolores Umbridge was not just a villain of Hogwarts. She was a tyrant of memory, a manipulator of bloodlines. Her hatred of her mother and brother wasn't passive. It was a campaign, long and sustained. She worked tirelessly to ensure no trace of them could ever threaten her place in magical society. And as the decades passed, and her name was etched into the darker pages of wizarding history, the truth remained obscured, buried beneath layers of fear, denial, and forged documents. Her obsession with blood purity was born not of belief, but of shame. She did not champion pure blood ideology because she loved it, but because it served her. The more she punished the impure, the more she distanced herself from her own origins. In a cruel twist of irony, the very system she upheld would have rejected her if it had known the truth. Dolores knew this. That knowledge haunted her, shaped her, and drove her into ever deeper cruelty. There's a chilling parallel between her treatment of Harry Potter and her own family. She targeted Harry not just because he opposed her, but because he reminded her of everything she hated: resistance, compassion, and most dangerously, truth. Harry exposed the ministry's lies just as her mother's existence exposed hers. He was a mirror she desperately wanted to shatter. In the end, Umbridge never faced trial for her family's erasure. She was imprisoned for her crimes during the Second Wizarding War, yes, but the world never learned how deeply her manipulations went. There were no official records, no public reckoning. Ellen Cracknell died in obscurity. Her brother, his fate unknown. Dolores had won that battle, even if she lost others. History has a way of unraveling secrets, and perhaps, someday, someone in the ministry's archives will stumble across a forgotten file, a letter never delivered, or a name crossed out in haste. Then the truth of Dolores Umbridge's war against her own blood will come to light, not just as a footnote in her biography, but as the darkest stain on her legacy. Number 25 had a personal vendetta against Hagrid. Dolores Umbridge never hid her disdain for those she considered beneath the standards of the ministry, and Rubeus Hagrid, with his towering frame and gentle, clumsy manner, became one of her prime targets. From the moment she set her polished shoes onto the grounds of Hogwarts as the new defense against the dark arts professor and High Inquisitor, she made it a personal mission to expose what she viewed as Hagrid's unsuitability. Her hatred was not simply bureaucratic, it was personal. She despised him, not only for his half-giant blood, but for the affection the school's staff and students held for him. This resentment festered quickly and deeply, turning into a campaign of humiliation and exclusion that stained that year at Hogwarts with bitter unfairness. To understand the depth of Umbridge's hostility toward Hagrid, one must look beyond the regulations and committee reports. Her true motives were rooted in prejudice, the same dangerous, thinly veiled bigotry that had led to persecution of magical beings for centuries. In her eyes, Hagrid embodied all that was untidy, unrefined, and uncontrollable. He was the antithesis of her neat, pink order. Her revulsion was not merely professional, but visceral. She considered him an animal pretending to be a man, and she used her authority to remind everyone, especially Hagrid himself, of this belief. Even before Hagrid returned from his secret mission to parley with the giants, Umbridge had been planning his downfall. When he finally reappeared at Hogwarts during Harry's 5th year, bruised and exhausted from an ordeal he refused to discuss, Umbridge struck. She subjected him to a series of unannounced inspections under the pretense of evaluating his teaching performance. But it was never about teaching. As Harry observed during one of these classes, Umbridge's quill was scratching busily as Hagrid explained the habits of thestrals, but she didn't look at the creatures. She stared at Hagrid with narrowed eyes and lips pressed into a tight line. She wasn't interested in the curriculum, she was documenting the case she had already decided to make. Hagrid's lessons were no more dangerous than those of any other Care of Magical Creatures class. In fact, when he introduced thestrals, he did so with gentleness and reverence, emphasizing their misunderstood nature. He treated them like noble creatures rather than threats, but Umbridge dismissed the thestrals entirely, not because they were unworthy subjects, but because they offered her no reason to label Hagrid as incompetent. When her plan to deem him unqualified based on subject matter faltered, she turned to more insidious tactics. Her reports began to focus on Hagrid's speech, his dialect, and the mere fact that he was half-giant. In her eyes, that alone should have barred him from employment. One night, her cruelty reached its apex. Umbridge, accompanied by ministry thugs and cloaked in the justification of security, led a brutal attack on Hagrid's hut. It was a raid in all but name. She attempted to arrest him without cause, planning to have him dragged from the grounds like a criminal. The attack was violent. Hagrid fought them off, but only barely, and Fang, his beloved boarhound, was injured in the fray. Harry and Hermione, hidden under the invisibility cloak nearby, watched in horror. The message was clear. She did not want to fire Hagrid. She wanted to ruin him. Even after she was ousted from Hogwarts, her influence continued to shadow Hagrid's life. In the months and years that followed, she reportedly used her remaining power within the ministry to quietly ensure that no department would ever consider him for future employment. Whether it was the Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures or even more obscure branches like the Committee on Experimental Charms, Hagrid's name was discreetly blacklisted. These actions were never public, never official, but they were real. Sources later confirmed that whenever his name appeared in an internal application or inquiry, someone high up would quietly veto it, often citing an unsatisfactory professional record, a phrase that had Umbridge's handwriting all over it. What made Umbridge's treatment of Hagrid especially cruel was her ability to manipulate the official channels while shielding herself from accusation. Everything she did was draped in protocol. She never once raised her voice in public, never issued a direct slur. Her reports were filled with phrases like, concerns regarding educational standards and questionable curriculum compliance. Yet the subtext was clear. She never viewed Hagrid as a teacher. She saw him as an animal who had wandered into a classroom, and she intended to drag him back out by force. Hagrid, for his part, never openly confronted Umbridge. He bore the inspections, the notes, and even the midnight ambush with a kind of wounded dignity. His silence was not submission, but sorrow. He had never pretended to be an academic. His pride was in the creatures he loved, and in the students who appreciated his passion. But Umbridge poisoned even that. Students began to question him, whispering behind his back. The fear that accompanied her regime affected everyone. She made people scared to speak up, Ron once said, even about Hagrid. That was her victory. Not in removing him outright, but in isolating him so thoroughly that he almost disappeared from the life of the school. What was perhaps most telling was that during the Battle of Hogwarts, when loyalties were tested and lines drawn, Hagrid fought with unwavering courage, and even then there were rumours that Umbridge lobbied against his presence among the defenders. Though she had no power at that point, she allegedly warned others that he was unpredictable and a liability. She could not bear to see him honoured among the defenders of Hogwarts, the very institution she believed she had once purified. Her hatred for Hagrid was not an isolated instance of cruelty. It reflected her worldview, one in which purity, pedigree, and conformity mattered above all. She distrusted hybrids, half-bloods, and anyone who did not fit her narrow mould of magical propriety. But with Hagrid, it was more than prejudice. It was a personal vendetta fueled by the fact that he was loved despite his flaws. That more than anything enraged her, the idea that someone like Hagrid could be accepted and even admired. "He's not like us," she once said, a quote overheard by an unnamed staff member. "He shouldn't be here. He doesn't belong." This notion of belonging was central to Umbridge's philosophy. Her pink cardigan authoritarianism was not about order, but about exclusion, and no one symbolized the warmth and acceptance of Hogwarts better than Hagrid. He welcomed every creature, every student, every outsider. His hut was a refuge, his smile a reassurance. Umbridge could not understand that kind of kindness. To her, compassion was a weakness. That Hagrid's strength came from it was both confusing and infuriating to her. Even within the Ministry, long after the events at Hogwarts, Umbridge reportedly made statements implying that giants, and by extension half-giants, were inherently violent and unsuitable for social integration. Though she never named Hagrid directly in these remarks, those who knew the truth saw through the euphemisms. She had not stopped her campaign, she had merely shifted it into the shadows where her influence still lingered. The tragedy of this vendetta was not only in what it cost Hagrid, but in what it revealed about the wizarding world itself. The fact that someone like Umbridge could so thoroughly target a man like Hagrid and face so little resistance spoke to the silent prejudices that still festered in magical society. Dumbledore had once warned, "We must all face the choice between what is right and what is easy." In this case, too many chose silence. But Hagrid endured. He continued to teach, to care for creatures, and to mentor students. His kindness outlived her cruelty. When young witches and wizards recall their years at Hogwarts, many remember the warmth of Hagrid's hut more clearly than the chill of Umbridge's inspections. Her legacy is one of fear and repression. His is one of courage, loyalty, and unconditional love. She tried to erase him. Instead, she immortalized him. Number 26 had no real friends, even among dark supporters. Dolores Umbridge, a woman cloaked in pink and drenched in the scent of fake sweetness, was perhaps one of the loneliest figures to ever rise through the ranks of the Ministry of Magic. Her ascent to power during Voldemort's return was not marked by camaraderie or loyalty, but by fear, manipulation, and an unshakable thirst for control. Even in an institution rotting from within, even among Death Eaters and dark sympathizers, Umbridge remained an outsider. Her brand of authoritarianism lacked the charisma of Voldemort, the loyalty of Bellatrix Lestrange, or even the bitter brotherhood of men like Yaxley or Dolohov. Instead, Dolores wrapped herself in policies, quills, and the shield of the law, enforcing cruelty with bureaucratic precision while alienating every soul in her path. Her time at Hogwarts was the first public sign of just how isolated she truly was. Appointed by the Ministry as High Inquisitor, she was meant to bring order to a school they believed was veering into dangerous territory. Instead, she created a regime of terror. Though she spoke of order, tradition, and safety, her real intent was domination of minds, voices, and thoughts. She ruled not with inspiration, but with punishments scratched into skin. Yet even then, as she strutted the hallways in her bows and smug superiority, the staff kept their distance. Professors like McGonagall and Flitwick followed protocol, but offered no warmth. Even Argus Filch, whose love of discipline could have made him a potential ally, remained no more than a tool in her arsenal. No teacher befriended her, no student admired her. She was not feared as Dumbledore had once been feared in battle. She was feared like a disease, something to be avoided at all costs. In the Ministry of Magic, where power often birthed alliances, Dolores was still an outlier. She held several influential positions, including senior undersecretary to the minister, and later assumed more significant authority during the second rise of Voldemort. Yet her relationships with fellow officials were hollow. Cornelius Fudge trusted her in his paranoia, but trust born of desperation is not friendship. Once Scrimgeour replaced Fudge, Dolores lost her protector. When Pius Thickness, under the Imperious Curse, took over the ministry during Voldemort's rule, Umbridge aligned herself without hesitation. But even among Death Eater-controlled leadership, she remained merely a pawn, a bureaucrat in black velvet. There is no record in memory or in book of any Death Eater calling her comrade or friend. One of the most telling moments of her isolation comes during the scene in Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, where Harry, Ron, and Hermione infiltrate the Ministry. Umbridge is presiding over a Muggleborn registration hearing, wearing a locket that once belonged to Salazar Slytherin, a locket that was also one of Voldemort's Horcruxes. The sight is jarring, Dolores wearing dark power like jewelry, mistaking ownership for alliance. "There are no half-breeds permitted to work at the Ministry," she snarls during the hearing. Yet, despite her apparent alignment with Voldemort's ideology, she is not truly one of his. No Death Eater would trust her with a Horcrux. She took it, unknowing of its true nature, clinging to what she thought was a symbol of pure-blood superiority. She was not chosen. She simply took what was left unattended. Unlike Bellatrix Lestrange, who basked in Voldemort's presence like a devoted disciple, Umbridge operated without inclusion in the inner circle. Bellatrix had companions in cruelty, whether the Lestrange brothers or fellow Death Eaters like Rodolphus or Rookwood. Even Severus Snape, enigmatic and double-dealing, had earned Voldemort's trust in the deepest layers of the movement. Umbridge had no such confidants. Her orders came from the top and trickled downward, but she was always on the periphery. She was the obedient functionary, not the trusted enforcer. Her preference for operating within legal frameworks made her distasteful even to those aligned with Voldemort's more radical methods. The Death Eaters did not admire laws, they manipulated them or destroyed them. Umbridge, however, used the law as her weapon of choice. She crafted oppressive rules, created fear through paperwork and proclamations, and gave legitimacy to acts of cruelty. But cruelty wrapped in parchment is not the same as the violent fervour the Death Eaters craved. They saw her not as a sister in arms, but as a useful cog in their mechanism of power, and when cogs wear down, they are replaced, not mourned. Dolores's most consistent trait, her eagerness to denounce and report others, further deepened her isolation. In a regime where betrayal was currency, Umbridge was a millionaire. She was quick to punish, to report subordinates, to betray those she suspected of disloyalty, even within her own ranks. Progress for the sake of progress must be discouraged, she once wrote on a wall at Hogwarts. It was not just progress she feared, it was change, unpredictability, the loosening of her grip. She trusted no one, and so no one trusted her. This paranoia turned her office into a fortress. During her time in the Ministry under Voldemort's control, she surrounded herself with framed cat plates, spells of protection, and employees who dared not breathe too loudly. But security is not companionship. Her subordinates acted out of fear, not admiration. None came to her for counsel, none lingered in her office after hours. Even in the heart of the magical government, she stood alone, a general without soldiers, a queen without court. Her brief time in Azkaban after the fall of Voldemort, though later dismissed as not officially charged, underscored her precarious status. Unlike other ministry officials who claimed coercion or ignorance, Umbridge had no defenders. Kingsley Shacklebolt, now Minister for Magic, did not protect her. She had earned no favours to be returned. Her record spoke for itself, and it was damning. No colleague stepped forward to vouch for her. She had once wielded power over their lives, and now they watched her fall with quiet satisfaction. Even in her written records and interactions, she never displayed warmth or personal connections. Her educational decrees at Hogwarts, her hearings at the ministry, her memos, all were cold, impersonal, efficient. She wrote to command, not to connect. No letters to family were ever mentioned, no mentions of friends from school. Her time at Hogwarts as a student was unremarkable, marked only by ambition and a quick rise in the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. But even then, she did not form lasting bonds. Her loyalty was always to the institution, never to individuals. What makes Umbridge's loneliness so tragic is not that she was misunderstood, but that she never sought understanding. She did not crave friendship, she craved obedience. She did not wish to be liked, she demanded submission. Even in moments when camaraderie might have protected her, when the tides turned after Voldemort's fall, she had no one to turn to. No ally, no former friend, no former student offered her refuge. Her power had never been based on respect or love, only control. And control, once broken, leaves behind nothing. In many ways, Umbridge represents the darkest side of institutional evil, the person who commits atrocities not for ideology, but for order, not out of passion, but protocol. Voldemort's followers, twisted though they were, operated out of belief, however vile. Umbridge acted out of ambition and the joy of domination, through rules. She never killed with a wand if she could accomplish the same with ink and quill. Her office at Hogwarts bore witness to that. "I must not tell lies," carved into Harry's hand, remains one of the most chilling scenes in the series, because it was not an act of passion, but of procedure. Perhaps most damning is that even Voldemort, with all his need for control and loyalty, never truly used her beyond convenience. He placed her in positions of visibility but not of trust. She never attended the inner meetings, never received the dark mark. In a world where Voldemort marked his followers with physical symbols, Umbridge remained unmarked. That absence was not mercy, it was dismissal. Her story is not one of redemption or misunderstood villainy. It is a tale of what happens when a person chooses power over people at every turn. Dolores Umbridge stood tall in every room she entered, but always alone. And when the world she helped to break began to crumble around her, she found herself buried beneath it, with no hand to lift her out. Number 27. Tried to rewrite school history. Dolores Umbridge did not merely impose rules, she rewrote the very fabric of Hogwarts history. Installed by the Ministry as the High Inquisitor, her ambitions went far beyond disciplining students or discrediting teachers. With her quill poised and her sickly smile firmly in place, Umbridge quietly turned her attention to one of the school's most sacred pillars, its past. History to her was not a record of facts, but a tool to manipulate. With surprising efficiency, she began to erase what did not serve her vision, to whitewash what was too dark, and to repaint herself and the Ministry as the central forces of virtue and order. Her mission wasn't to educate, it was to indoctrinate. One of her first targets was Professor Binns's curriculum. Though the ghostly history of magic teacher had long been known for his tedious lectures, he had always maintained a certain academic neutrality. Umbridge found this neutrality dangerous. She circulated a memo stating that any references to the return of he who must not be named or to any recent conflicts would be classified as dangerous misinformation. Lessons were to focus on certified ministry-approved history, which included glowing accounts of Cornelius Fudge's leadership and heavily censored versions of the First Wizarding War. "The Ministry guarantees your safety," the new handbooks proclaimed, "because the Ministry has always been right." Umbridge then set her eyes on the textbooks themselves. She ordered a review of all teaching materials, dismissing many of them as historically inflammatory. The Rise and Fall of the Dark Arts, a popular source on Voldemort's early years, was removed from the shelves. Any textbook that discussed Albus Dumbledore's opposition to the Ministry or questioned official narratives was swiftly banned. In their place, students were given A History of Peace, the Ministry's Triumph over Chaos, a thinly veiled propaganda piece ghost-written by a Ministry clerk with no known credentials. The book featured exaggerated tales of Fudge's supposed bravery, and even included a chapter titled Dolores Jane Umbridge, a loyal defender of magical order, complete with a watercolor portrait of her smiling under a fluttering Ministry flag. What disturbed many students most was her censorship of the school archives. In the dead of night, with only Filch and a few Ministry officials for company, Umbridge descended into the restricted section and began sorting through Hogwarts' vast records. Files were pulled, rewritten, or simply vanished. Detention records related to Death Eater sympathizers were erased, especially if those individuals now held positions of influence. Testimonies from survivors of Voldemort's reign were discarded or revised, even archived copies of the Daily Art. Prophet, which had once chronicled the horrors of the First and Second Wizarding Wars, were redacted, their headlines altered to suit a more comforting tale. Umbridge's control extended even further to the very walls of the castle. Hogwarts is alive with memory, and its portraits remember. For centuries, headmasters and influential witches and wizards had been immortalized in paintings that lined the corridors and offices. These portraits spoke, moved, and offered commentary to any who passed. Umbridge saw them as liabilities. Phineas Nigellus Black's portrait, always keen to criticize Ministry incompetence, was removed from public view. Dilys Derwent, a former headmistress and noted healer who had spoken out in favor of Dumbledore's resistance during the First Wizarding War, found her frame turned to face the wall. Insubordination, Umbridge wrote in a report, inappropriate influence on student morale. Even the famed tapestry of the Battle of Hogwarts, an enchanted piece woven by house elves to commemorate the school's victory, was hidden away. Though recently created, it had quickly become a symbol of unity and courage, featuring depictions of Harry Potter, Neville Longbottom, and others as they fought against Voldemort's forces. The tapestry celebrated rebellion. That was precisely what Umbridge could not tolerate. To her, it was a glorification of chaos. She replaced it with a dull banner stitched with the Ministry's crest and the words order, obedience, progress. Her obsession with historical control didn't stop with material objects. Students were required to write essays on the Ministry's role in preserving peace, and any deviation from approved narratives resulted in immediate punishment. One third-year Ravenclaw named Elsie Bramley received detention for citing the eyewitness accounts of the Battle of the Department of Mysteries. Falsifying history to support anarchists, Umbridge scrawled in red ink. Detention, 1 week, no quills. It was a chilling reminder of how even thought was being criminalized. Most chilling of all, perhaps, was her attempt to reframe the role of Harry Potter himself. He was not, in her narrative, a survivor or a symbol of resistance. Instead, he was cast as a disturbed and dangerous youth with a penchant for disruption. His claims about Voldemort's return were labelled as attention-seeking delusions. Her official line, echoed in pamphlets handed out at school assemblies, was that no credible authority had verified the Dark Lord's resurrection. A ministry-issued poster declared, "Trust the ministry, not teenage fantasies." Umbridge took particular pride in crafting her own legacy within this twisted version of history. In the newly distributed materials, she was portrayed as an unsung heroine who had protected Hogwarts during a time of great unrest. Her firm but fair leadership, one leaflet claimed, kept our beloved schools safe from radicals and fearmongers. She even commissioned a series of magical plates depicting herself shaking hands with various historical figures, many of whom had died centuries before. They were obviously enchanted forgeries, but to her they were evidence of greatness. Some teachers resisted quietly. Professor McGonagall, ever dignified, refused to use the new textbooks, instead conducting lessons from memory. "If we are to forget where we came from," she told a class of 5th years, "we are bound to repeat our darkest mistakes." But open defiance meant removal. Charity Burbage was transferred to another department after questioning the historical accuracy of Umbridge's claims. Professors who did not fall in line were labelled subversive or unfit for the classroom. Students whispered about her after lights out. Rumours spread that she was keeping a secret ledger of every comment made in class, of every essay that questioned the official story. There were even whispers that she had sent names to the ministry, ensuring that dissenters would face scrutiny well beyond Hogwarts. Fear, not education, became the dominant force in the castle. As Hermione Granger would later reflect, we weren't learning history, we were being taught how to forget. One day, a second-year Hufflepuff named Jared Moon noticed something odd in the library. The pages of his copy of Hogwarts, A History, had been altered. He swore that the sections detailing the school's founding values, tolerance, bravery, and wisdom, had been rewritten to emphasize obedience and structure. Madame Pince, the librarian, grew pale when he pointed it out. "You didn't see anything," she whispered, and swiftly took the book away. It was never seen again. Even Peeves, the poltergeist, normally a source of mischief rather than resistance, began to target Umbridge's portrait banners and ministry signage. He defaced slogans with ink and caused enchanted signs to collapse in the corridors. Students began to read into his actions a kind of underground resistance. In the absence of Dumbledore, in the suffocating silence of Umbridge's rewritten world, even Peeves became a symbol of rebellion. Yet Umbridge believed in her mission completely. She once said, as noted by Professor Flitwick in a later testimony, "History is not what happened, history is what is remembered." In those words lay the true danger she posed. Because for Dolores Umbridge, truth was malleable, memory could be erased. And if the walls of Hogwarts no longer told the stories of courage, resistance, and truth, then perhaps she could finally claim victory, not over Voldemort, but over reality itself.